A man needs his hobbies, and sometimes, if he's lucky, those hobbies can help him deal with a problem. Though not always the way you would expect. The Reluctant Orchid by Arthur C. Clarke. Read by Karl. Though few people in the White Hart will concede that any of Harry Purvis's stories are actually true, everyone agrees that some are much more probable than others. In any sense of probability, the affair of the Reluctant Orchid must rate very low indeed. Don't remember what ingenious gambit Harry used to launch this narrative. Maybe some orchid fancier brought him the latest monstrosity into the bar, and that set him off. No matter, I do remember the story, and after all, that's what matters. The adventure did not, this time, concern any of Harry's numerous relatives, and he avoided explaining just how he managed to know so many of the sordid details. The hero, if you can call him that, of this hothouse epic was an inoffensive little quirk named Hercules Keating. If you think that is the most unlikely part of the story, just stick around a while. Hercules is not the sort that you can carry off lightly at the best of times. When you're 4'9" and it looks as though you would have to take a physical culture course before you could even become a 97-pound weakling, it is a positive embarrassment. Perhaps I might explain why Hercules had very little social life, and all of his real friends grew in pots in a human conservatory at the bottom of his garden. His needs were simple, and he spent very little money on himself. Consequently, his collection of orchids and cacti was indeed very remarkable. Indeed, he had a wide reputation among the fraternity of cactophiles, now perceived from remote corners of the globe parcel smelling of mold and tropical jungles. Hercules had only one living relative. It would have been hard to find a greater contrast than Aunt Henrietta. She was a massive 6-footer, usually found wearing a rather loud line in Harris tweeds, drove a Jaguar with reckless skill, and chain-smoked cigars. Her parents set their hearts on a boy, never been able to decide whether or not their wish had been granted. Henrietta earned a living, quite a good one, breeding dogs of various shapes and sizes. She was selling well on a couple of her latest models, and they were not the type of portable canines which ladies like to carry in their handbags. The Keating kennel specialized in Great Danes, Alsatians, and St. Bernards. Henrietta, rightly despising men of the weaker sex, had never married. However, for some reason she took an avuncular, yes, that is definitely the right word, interest in Hercules, called to see him almost every weekend. It's a curious kind of relationship. Probably Henrietta found that Hercules bolstered up her feelings of superiority. She was a good example of the male sex. They were certainly a pretty sorry lot. Yet, if this was Henrietta's motivation, she wasn't conscious of it and seemed generally fond of her nephew. She was patronizing, but never unkind. As might be expected, her attention did not exactly help Hercules' own well-developed inferiority complex. First he tolerated his aunt, then he came to dread her regular visits, her booming voice, and her bone-crushing handshake, and at last he grew to hate her. Eventually, indeed, his hate became the dominant emotion in his life, exceeding even his love for his orchids. He was careful not to show it, realizing that if Aunt Henrietta decided how she felt about her, she would probably break him in two and throw the pieces to her wolf pack. There was no way, then, in which Hercules could express his pent-up feelings. He had to be polite to Aunt Henrietta, even when he felt like murder. He often did feel like murder, though he knew there was nothing he could ever do about it. Until one day, according to the dealer, the orchid came from somewhere in the Amazon region, a rather vague postal address. When Hercules first saw it, it was not a very prepossessing sight, even to anyone who loved orchids as much as he did. A shapeless fruit about the size of a man's fist, that was all. It was redolent of decay. There was the faintest hint of a rank carrion smell. Hercules was not even sure it was viable, and told the dealer as much. Preston able to purchase it for a trifling sum, and he carried it home without much enthusiasm. She showed no signs of life for the first few months, but that did not worry Hercules. Then one day, a tiny green shoot appeared and started to creep up to the light. After progress was rapid. Soon it was a thick, fleshy stem as big as a man's forearm and colored a positively virulent green. Near the top of the stem, a series of curious bulges circled the plant. Otherwise, it was completely featureless. Hercules was now quite excited. He was sure of some entirely new species to swim into his ken. The rate of growth was really fantastic. Soon the plant was taller than Hercules. Not that was saying a great deal. Moreover, the bulges seemed to be developing. Looked as if at any moment the orchid would burst into bloom. Hercules waited anxiously, knowing how short-lived some flowers can be. spent as much time as he possibly could in the hothouse. Despite all his watchfulness, the transformation occurred one night when he was asleep. In the morning, the orchid was fringed by a series of 8 dangling tendrils, almost reaching to the ground. They must have developed inside the plant and emerged with, for the vegetable world, explosive speed. Hercules stared at the phenomenon in amazement and went very thoroughly to work. That evening, as he watered the plant and checked its soil, he noticed a still more peculiar fact. The tendrils were thickening and were not completely motionless. They had a slight but unspeakable tendency to vibrate, as if possessing a life of their own. Even Hercules, for all his interest and enthusiasm, found this more than a little disturbing. A few days later, there was no doubt about it at all. When he approached the orchid, the tendrils swayed toward him in an unpleasantly suggestive fashion. The impression of hunger was so strong that Hercules began to feel very uncomfortable indeed. Something started to nag at the back of his mind. It was quite a while before he could recall what it was. He said to himself, "Of course, how stupid of me," and went along to the local library. Here I spent a most interesting half hour rereading a little piece by one H.G. Wells entitled "The Flowering of the Strange Orchid." My goodness, thought Hercules when he finished the tale. As yet there had been no stupefying odor which might overpower the plant's intended victim, but otherwise the characteristics were all too similar. Hercules went home in a very unsettled mood indeed. He opened the conservatory door and stood there looking among the avenue of greenery towards his prized specimen. He judged the length of the tendrils, already found himself calling them tentacles, with great care and walked to within what appeared to be a safe distance. The plant certainly had an impression of alertness and menace far more appropriate to the animals in the vegetable kingdom. Hercules remembered the unfortunate history of Dr. Frankenstein and was not amused. But really, this was ridiculous. Such things didn't happen in real life. Well, there was one way to put matters to the test. Hercules ran into the house and came back a few minutes later with a broomstick, to the end of which he attached a piece of raw meat. Feeling a considerable fool, he advanced towards the orchid as a lion tamer might approach one of his charges at mealtime. For a moment, nothing happened. The two of the tendrils developed in an agitated twitch. It began to sway back and forth as if the plant was making up its mind. Abruptly, they whipped out with such speed they practically vanished from view. They wrapped themselves around the meat, and Hercules felt a powerful tug at the end of his broomstick. Then the meat was gone. The orchid was clutching it, if one may mix metaphor slightly, to its bosom. "Jehovah Jehoshaphat!" yelled Hercules. Very seldom indeed he used such strong language. The orchid showed no further signs of life for 24 hours. It was waiting for the meat to come high and was also developing a digestive system. But the next day, a network of short roots had covered the still viable chunk of meat. By nightfall, the meat was gone. The plant had tasted blood. Hercules' emotions as he watched over his prize were curiously mixed. There were times when it only gave him nightmares. He foresaw a whole range of horrid possibilities. The orchid was now extremely strong. Got within his clutches, he would be done for. But of course there was not the slightest danger of that. He arranged a system of pipes so he could water from a safe distance, and as the less orthodox food he simply tossed within range of his tentacles. He was now eating a pound of raw meat a day, and he had an uncomfortable feeling that he could cope with much larger quantities if given the opportunity. Hercules' natural qualms were, on the whole, outweighed by a feeling of triumph that such a botanical marvel had fallen into his hands. Whenever he chose, he could become the most famous orchid grower in the world. Typical of the somewhat restrictive viewpoint, it never occurred to him that other people besides orchid fanciers might be interested in his pet. The creature was now about 6 feet tall, and apparently still growing, though much more slowly than it had been. All the other plants had moved from its end of the conservatory, not so much because Hercules feared they might be cannibalistic, as to enable him to treat them without danger. He stretched a rope across the central aisle, so no risk of his accidentally walking within range of those 8 dangling arms. It was obvious the orchid had a highly developed nervous system, and something very nearly approaching intelligence. He knew it was going to be fed, and exhibited unmistakable signs of pleasure. Most fantastic of all, though Hercules was still not sure about this, it seemed capable of producing sounds. There were times, just before a meal, when he fancied he'd hear an incredibly high-pitched whistle skirting the edge of audibility. A newborn bat might have had such a voice. I wonder what purpose it served. Did the orchid somehow lure its prey into its clutches by sound? If so, he did not think its technique would work on him. While Hercules was making these interesting discoveries, he continued to be fussed over by Aunt Marietta and assaulted by her hounds, which were never as house-trained as she claimed them to be. She occasionally rode up the street on a Sunday afternoon with one dog in a seat beside her and another occupying most of the baggage compartments. Then she would bound up the stairs two at a time, nearly deafened Hercules with her greeting, half paralyzing with her handshake and both cigar smoke in his face. There had been times she was terrified she would kiss him, but Alexis realized that such effeminate behavior was foreign to her nature. Aunt Henrietta looked upon Hercules' orchids with some scorn. Spending one's spare time in a hothouse was, she considered, a very effete recreation. When she wanted to let off steam, she went big game hunting in Kenya. This had nothing to endear her to Hercules, who hated blood sports. But despite his mounting dislike for his overpowering aunt, every Friday afternoon he had dutifully prepared tea for her when they had a tete-a-tete together, which, on the surface at least, seemed perfectly friendly. Henry never guessed that as he poured the tea, Hercules often wished it was poisoned. She was, far down beneath her extensive of fortifications, fundamentally a good-hearted person, and knowledge would have upset her deeply. Hercules did not mention his vegetable octopus to Aunt Henrietta. He occasionally showed her some more interesting specimens. This was something he was keeping for himself. Perhaps, even before he had fully formulated his diabolical plan, his subconscious was already preparing the ground. It was late one Sunday evening, when the roar of the jaguar had died into the night, and Hercules was stirring his shattered nerves in the conservatory, the idea first came full-fledged into his mind. He was staring at the orchid, noticing how the tendrils were now as thick around as a man's thumb, when a most pleasing fantasy suddenly flashed before his eyes. He pictured Aunt Henrietta struggling helplessly in the grip of the monster, unable to escape from its carnivorous clutches. Why, it would be the perfect crime. The distraught nephew would arrive on the scene too late to be of assistance, and when the police answered his frantic call, they would see at a glance the whole affair was a deplorable accident. True, there would be an inquest, but the coroner's censure would be toned down in view of Hercules' obvious grief. The more he thought of the idea, the more he liked it. He could see no flaws, as long as the orchid cooperated. That, clearly, would be the greatest problem. Have to plan a course of training for the creature. The orchid looked sufficiently diabolical. He was given a disposition to suit his appearance. Considering he had no prior experience in such matters, there was no such authorities he could consult, Hercules proceeded along very sound and businesslike lines. He used a fishing rod to dangle pieces of meat just outside the orchid's range, so the creature lashed its tentacles in a frenzy. At sometimes, its high-pitched squeak was clearly audible, and Hercules wondered how it managed to produce the sound. He also wondered what its orchid's perception were. This is yet another mystery that could not be solved without close examination. Perhaps Aunt Henrietta, if all went well, would have a brief opportunity of discovering those interesting facts. She would probably be too busy to report them for the benefit of posterity. There was no doubt the beast was quite powerful enough to deal with its intended victim. It had once wrenched the broomstick out of Hercules' grip, although that in itself proved very little. The sickening crack of the wood a moment later brought a smile of satisfaction to his trainer's thin lips. He began to be much more pleasant and attentive to his aunt. In every respect, indeed, he was the model nephew. When Hercules considered that his picador techniques had brought the orchid into the right frame of mind, he wondered if he should test it with live bait. This is a problem that worried him for some weeks, during which time he would often look speculatively at every dog or cat he passed in the street. But he finally abandoned the idea, for a rather peculiar reason. He was simply too kind-hearted to put it into practice, and Henrietta would have to be its first victim. He starved the orchid for 2 weeks before he put his plan into action. This is as long as he dared risk. He did not wish to weaken the beast, merely to whet its appetite. Then the outcome of the encounter might be more certain. And so, when he carried the teacups back into the kitchen and was sitting upwind of Aunt Henrietta's cigar, he said casually, "I've got something I'd like to show you, Auntie. We're keeping it as a surprise. It'll tickle you to death." That, he thought, was not a completely accurate description, but it gave the general idea. Auntie took the cigar out of her mouth and looked at Hercules with frank surprise. "Well," she boomed, "wonders will never cease. What have you been up to, you rascal?" She slapped him playfully on the back and showed all the air of his lungs. "You'll never believe it," gritted Henry, who had recovered his breath. "It's in the conservatory." "Eh?" said Auntie, obviously puzzled. "Yes, come on and have a look. It's going to cause a real sensation." Auntie gave a snort that might have indicated disbelief, but followed Hercules without further question. The two Alsatians, now busily chewing up the carpet, looked at her anxiously and half rose to their feet, but she waved them away. "It's all right, boys," she ordered gruffly. "I'll be back in a minute." Hercules thought this unlikely. It was a dark evening. and the lights in the conservatory were off. As he entered, Auntie snorted, "Gad, Hercules, the place smells like a slaughterhouse. Haven't met such a stink since I shot that elephant in Bulawayo, and we couldn't find it for a week." "Sorry, Auntie," apologized Hercules, propelling her forward to the gloom. "It's a new fertilizer I'm using. Produces the most stunning results. Go on, in a couple of yards. I want this to be a real surprise." "Hope this isn't a joke," said Auntie suspiciously as she stomped forward. "I can promise you it's no joke," replied Hercules, standing with his hand on the light switch. He could just see the looming bulk of the orchid. Auntie was now within 10 feet of it. Wait until she was well inside the danger zone and threw the switch. It was the first moment when the scene was transfixed with light. Then Aunt Henrietta ground to a halt and stood, arms akimbo, in front of the giant orchid. For a moment, Hercules was afraid she would retreat before the plant came into action. Then she saw she was calmly scrutinizing it, and able to make her mind what the devil it was. It was full 5 seconds before the orchid moved. Then the dangling tendrils flashed into action, but not the way Hercules had expected. The plant clutched them tightly, protectively, around itself. At the same time, it gave a high-pitched scream of pure terror. In a moment of sickening disillusionment, Hercules realized the awful truth. His orchid was an utter coward. Might be able to cope with the wildlife of the Amazon jungle, but coming suddenly upon Aunt Henrietta had completely broken its nerve. As for its proposed victim, she stood watching the creature with astonishment, which swiftly changed to another emotion. She spun around on her heels and pointed an accusing finger at her nephew. "Hercules!" she roared. "The poor thing's scared to death. Have you one bowling yet?" Hercules could only stand with his head hanging low in shame and frustration. "No, Auntie," he quavered. "I guess it's naturally nervous." "Well, I'm used to animals. She recalled me before. You must treat them firmly but gently. Kindness always works, as long as you show them you do know the master. There, don't be frightened of Auntie. She won't hurt you." It was, thought Hercules in his blank despair, a revolting sight. With surprising gentleness, Aunt Henrietta fussed over the beast, petting and stroking it until the tentacles relaxed and the shrill whistling scream died away. After a few minutes of his pandering, it appeared to get over its fright. Hercules finally fled with a muffled sob when one of the tentacles crept forward and began to stroke Henrietta's gnarled fingers. From that day he was a broken man. What was worse, he could never escape from the consequences of his intended crime. Henrietta had acquired a new pet, was liable to call not only at weekends, but 2 or 3 times in between as well. It's obvious she did not trust Hercules to treat the orchid properly, and still suspected of bullying it. She would bring tasty tidbits that even her dogs had rejected, but which the orchid accepted with delight. The smell, which had so far been confined to the conservatory, began to creep into the house. And there, concluded Harry Purvis as he brought this improbable narrative to a close, the matter rests. To the satisfaction of 2, at any rate, of the parties concerned. The orchid is happy, and Aunt Henrietta has something else to dominate. From time to time, the creature has a nervous breakdown when a mouse gets loose in the conservatory. She rushes to console it. As for Hercules, there's no chance he will ever give any more trouble to either of them. It seemed to have sunk into a kind of a vegetable sloth. Indeed, Henry thought, every day it becomes more and more like an orchid himself. The harmless variety, of course. The end.